Hello and welcome to the Truman Library Institute's webinar, President Truman's Return Home, honoring the 75th anniversary of the presidency of Harry S. Truman. Today we're joined by Doug Richardson, Chief of Interpretations and Visitor Services at the Harry S. Truman National Historic Site, who will share stories from President Truman's first visit home after his inauguration. Doug, thank you for joining us.
It's my honor. Thank you. Thank you. And to all of you out there, thank you for joining us on this very special night. My name is Doug Richardson, and I'm the Chief Ranger at Harry S. Truman National Historic Site in what Harry S. Truman once called the center of the world, Independence, Missouri. So I'm speaking to you this evening from Kansas City through my favorite place in the world, 219 North Delaware Street, the Summer White House. From 1945 to 1953, the second, perhaps, most famous address in America. Before we begin, I would really like to thank all of my friends at the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library Museum and the Truman Library Institute. And suffice it to say this, I really do believe that Mr. Truman would be very, very proud of the staff of the Truman Library and the Truman Library Institute for all that they have done over the last 63 years, and he would be thrilled with what they're doing right now. So I tip my Ranger hat to the staff of the Truman Library and to the Institute. Thank you, and I'm very proud to call you my friends and my colleagues. I would like to dedicate what we talk about tonight to a couple different groups. The first group I would like to dedicate tonight to is that group that Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation, the soldiers, the sailors, those on the home front who in various ways served our nation and helped create the world that we are in today. We are living today on the shoulders of the greatest generation. They made all that we do possible. And so I tip my Ranger hat to them. I would also like to dedicate tonight to those of you who are watching and listening tonight, for whom the year 2020 has not been what you hoped. For those of you who are struggling in any way in 2020, our hearts go out to you. We are with you tonight. And if President Truman were with us, and I really do think that he is with us, but if President Truman were physically with us tonight, he would look into the camera. And yes, I do think that he would love Zoom a lot. I think President Truman would look you right in the eye via the camera and say, everything's going to be okay. We'll get through this. And so tonight is dedicated to all of you. This is a special year, the 75th anniversary of the events of 1945. And we had so much planned, but of course, things happen, so I'm excited to be able to be with you this way tonight. It's one of the most consequential years in American history and world history. And I think it's important to remember something, that even though it seems like 75 years seems like a long time, it's really not. It's relatively recent history. And I would ask you to do this. I would ask you to pick up whatever newspaper you're reading today, or check out whatever news source you are looking at today, whatever you use to be informed. And I think that you would find that in so many ways, the issues that we are dealing with in 2020 are many of the same issues that Harry Truman and his administration and the American people faced 75 years ago. Some things change, some things don't. And so it is very important that we commemorate this most important year. So 1945 began with the inauguration of Franklin Roosevelt as President of the United States for an unprecedented fourth term. It was clear to all those who were watching that Franklin Roosevelt was not well. Many knew that he wasn't well, but for many, including a generation, he was the only president that they had ever known. Beside him, taking the oath of office, was his new vice president, a sprite, young-looking man from the state of Missouri, a fellow by the name of Harry Truman. Now, starting with the nomination of Harry Truman as Vice President of the United States, many wanted to know more about this senator from Missouri. And I would ask you to think of it this way, my friends. Think about who we are and where we have been in our lives. Who we are today, June 30th, 2020, is the culmination of who we have been through our lives. And that's true of Harry Truman. So I'd like to briefly take you through Truman's life and explain to you and show you how everything that Truman went through, everything that Truman lived up until this point helped him prepare for 1945. And I'd like to share with you one of my favorite photographs from Truman's youth, and it's his high school graduation photograph. And when you see this photograph, perhaps you can think of your own high school photograph. I know I got the courage up to take a look at mine for the first time in over 30 years. And think about when you had your high school photograph taken, think about what you were thinking about, what plans you had for the future. Did they work out the way that you thought those plans would? Did you have detours along the way? Did your life turn out completely different than you thought that it would? Well, behold this photograph, taken in 1901. Harry Truman was about 17 years old. And Harry Truman is in the back row. He is third from the left, glasses on, very nice looking tie. His hand is on the shoulder of one of his friends. Truman has a very determined look on his face. Harry Truman did have plans for his life. Now, by this point in 1901, Truman had lived a full life. He had moved to Independence when he was 6. When he was at the Presbyterian Church Sunday School, he met a beautiful little girl that he fell in love with, that he would never fall out of love with. He excelled in school. He had overcome some serious health issues, one of those being diphtheria. And Harry Truman's mother, Martha Ellen Truman, treated Harry Truman with diphtheria, which actually paralyzed him for several months, with whiskey. It helped create an aversion to most whiskeys. So Truman had lived quite an extensive life in Independence to that point, and he had plans of going on and in his way changing the world. Now, in the bottom corner, the left corner of the photograph there, you're going to see another very handsome young man sitting right off the steps, and that man is Charles G. Ross, valedictorian of Independence High, class of 1901, a very close friend of Harry Truman's, who would play a very important role in Truman's life and Truman's administration. And on the opposite side of the photograph, second row up at the end, you're going to see a beautiful young Bessie Wallace of Independence with a very beautiful, amused look on her face. They all had plans on changing the world, as do all high school students, but their paths would take very different directions. Shortly after Harry Truman left Independence High, his family suffered a financial reversal. And because of that, he was not able to attend college as he wished. That is why Truman remains today our last president to date without a college degree. But what Truman did was he gained a worldly experience in different ways. He had a series of jobs. He worked for a newspaper in Kansas City for a while and bundled newspapers, and he worked at a couple of banks. But then by 1906, Truman answered his family's call and returned to his family's farm in Grandview, Missouri. We could drive to Grandview from Independence today in just about 20 minutes, but in their world, Independence was like a lifetime away from Grandview. It was his maternal grandmother's farm, and he answered a call to go back to the family farm in Grandview to help out his grandmother Young, to help out his mother and father and brother and sister. It was a very unique business arrangement, but besides the business arrangement at the farm, Truman gained some skills on the farm in Grandview and in the town of Grandview that served him well the rest of his life. When he sat on a cultivator working on that farm in Grandview, he said that it gave him time to sort out all of the world's problems. Like all farmers who work extremely hard, Harry Truman made a connection with the ground. He understood the ground. He understood the power of nature. He understood the importance of farming and agriculture in the world. While living in Grandview, he followed in his father's footsteps, and he got involved in local politics. He got involved in his local church. The photograph that you see there is one of my favorites. And one of my heroes, the late Dr. Robert Farrell, author of several books on Harry Truman, told a wonderful story about this photograph, that one day an archivist or a historian or somebody brought this photograph to the attention of Harry Truman and told Mr. Truman, Mr. President, now we have this photograph. We understand that it is of your family's farm, but we're having difficulty in identifying the farmhand on this plow. And it was said that Truman's eyes twinkled, and he looked at them and said, I can certainly identify the farmhand. That is me. Understanding the land, understanding the people, understanding the way of life of an agrarian society came back to benefit Harry Truman and the American people and the world in many ways over the years. After several years on the farm, Harry Truman, even though he didn't need to, he answered his family's call, or the nation's call, to serve in the military and to serve in the Great War. Harry Truman served as captain of an artillery battery, Company D of the 129th Field Artillery, only about 60 or 65 miles away from where my grandfather served in World War I. And not a day goes by that I don't wonder if perhaps my grandfather and Harry Truman maybe saw one another. I'll never know the answer to that. Harry Truman had no requirement to go to France and serve his nation. He was over the conscription age. He was technically, legally blind. His brother said that the only reason he got back into the service was because he sort of cheated on his eye exam. He was a farmer, which was important, of course, in wartime. And he was also the primary caregiver for his mother and sister on the farm. Harry Truman's father had died a few years before, in 1914. And also, while working on the farm, Harry Truman was waging his most important campaign in that he was trying to win the hand of a beautiful, blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl who lived up in Independence by the name of Bessie Wallace. He walked away from all of that temporarily, serving for that land, for Jackson County, the state, the country, the flag that he loved. While in France, Harry Truman and all of our soldiers who served saw the horrors of war. They knew the awfulness of war. It was part of Harry Truman. It was part of that generation. He understood. He was very happy to come home, bounding off of the ship, the Zeppelin, coming home in 1919. His focus was on coming home, and finally, after probably about a 9-year courtship, he got the girl. And on June 28th, 1919, in that beautiful church, on that day, Bess Wallace became Mrs. Harry S. Truman. Last year, the National Park Service, with our partners at the Independence Square and the Truman Library and the Truman Library Institute, commemorated and celebrated the 100th wedding anniversary of Harry and Bess Truman. And I am still on a euphoric high from that. And I will never forget standing right there at that altar 100 years to the moment. It was remarkable. So on June 28th, 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed, and Harry Truman won his greatest campaign. He won the hand of Bess Wallace, who would be of invaluable assistance and service to him over the years. 100 years ago right now, we love to talk and think about Harry Truman's first post-World War I adventure with a business partner by the name of Eddie Jacobson. They opened a clothing store in Kansas City, close to the Mulebach Hotel. Truman and Jacobson must have been just a wonderful store. Take a look at that wonderful inventory there. You have salespersons who knew their material, and those first months of Truman and Jacobson were very successful. Unfortunately, Truman and Jacobson fell victim to a nationwide recession, and the store didn't last nearly as long as Mr. Truman and Mr. Jacobson would have liked it to have lasted. But again, this was a learning lesson for Harry Truman, not necessarily the world of retail, but perhaps retail politics, again, of getting to know people, understanding people, and wanting to help people. So coming out of the story of Truman and Jacobson, Truman became involved in local politics. And with the assistance of the local Pendergast political machine, he obtained his first political job as Eastern District Judge of Jackson County in Missouri. And for our friends tonight who aren't from the state of Missouri, that phrase seems a little odd, county judge, considering he didn't have a degree or didn't finish law school, but what that means in much of the country is a county commissioner. So over the course of a few terms, first as Eastern District Judge of Jackson County, and then as presiding judge of Jackson County, Harry Truman, for all intents and purposes, with his fellow county judges and the people of Jackson County, put Jackson County on the map. And later on, in the middle of the Depression, despite the suffering that was happening in Missouri and in Jackson County, Harry Truman and the people of Jackson County were able to almost completely rebuild the infrastructure of Jackson County. And all of this helped Truman prepare politically for the bigger leagues that he would be playing in. The years of county judge are some of the most fascinating in Harry Truman's history. You are certainly familiar with the controversy with the Pendergast machine, and no doubt Harry Truman had to wrestle with some of the ethical dilemmas that he found while working in the Pendergast machine and in Jackson County. But at the end of his term as presiding judge of Jackson County, I really believe that Harry Truman could hold his head up very high, as could the people of Jackson County, and that the work that he did was very good work. The work that the employees, that the workers did in building the roads and building hospitals, courthouses, and all of the other infrastructure in Jackson County, their work was nothing short of excellent, and we can still see the remnants of that. The legacy of that still survives in Jackson County today. And how else can we say that Harry Truman did an incredible job as county judge, as a county commissioner in Jackson County? The reality that when he left the office to take his next step in the political world, he left that office no richer than he was when he went in. So Harry Truman could hold his head very high when it comes to serving as judge. At the age of 50, Harry Truman was elected junior senator for the state of Missouri. And what an incredible career trajectory we have now. At the age of 50, he was now a United States Senator for the state of Missouri. He had his beautiful wife at his side. He had a beautiful daughter, Mary Margaret, and so his world was complete. For 10 years, Harry Truman served in the United States Senate and again could hold his head very, very high. Quite honestly, when he entered the United States Senate, there were some people who wouldn't give Harry Truman the time of day. Some called him, sneered and called him the great senator from Pendergast. But very soon, Truman learned the institution of the Senate. He loved the institution of our legislature, the the possibility of using the legislature and the power of the government for doing good for people. He developed good relationships with fellow legislators, was a staunch supporter of the New Deal, and so much more. Franklin Roosevelt knew of the value of Senator Truman of Missouri. And again, another period in Truman's life that he could be very proud of. One of the things that Harry Truman did while serving as senator for the state of Missouri is that he sat in charge of a very powerful committee that was called by many the Truman Committee, which investigated defense appropriations in the war to that point. And, you know, no two historians really agree, but probably the work of the so-called Truman Committee helped save the American people millions, if not billions of dollars, and more importantly, made that money go to better use during the war effort. And so Truman and his fellow members of the committee, the Congress, can really hold their heads high on Truman's years in the United States Senate. He loved the Senate. I believe that Truman could have stayed in the Senate for the rest of his life, and he would have loved every minute of it. But in the summer of 1944, after a very interesting process, Franklin Roosevelt added Harry Truman to the ticket so that the ticket in November of 1944 would be Franklin Roosevelt and Harry S. Truman. There are a lot of reasons for that, but that's the ticket that was elected in November of 1944, leading to that inauguration that we were talking about in early 1945. Truman was only Vice President of the United States for just over 80 days. He had just concluded a busy day as presiding officer in the United States Senate. He wrote some letters to some family back home, and he and some colleagues and friends were about to gather in the Speaker of the House's office in the United States Capitol to break open a deck of cards and some bourbon. Harry Truman received a phone call in what was called the Board of Education that changed his life. The Vice President was asked to come to the White House quickly, quietly. This Truman did. He got to the White House in a few moments, was taken directly to First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. It was Eleanor Roosevelt who informed Harry Truman that he was now President of the United States. Eleanor Roosevelt looked Harry Truman right in the eye and said, "Harry, the President is dead." Truman didn't know what to say. He simply looked at her and said, "Mrs. Roosevelt, is there anything I can do for you?" And she said, "No, Harry. Is there anything I can do for you now? For you are the one in trouble." Very quickly, President Truman authorized a military plane for Mrs. Roosevelt to go be with her husband in Warm Springs. Truman called his wife, his daughter, and his mother-in-law in their apartment down the road on Connecticut Avenue. And Mrs. Truman and Margaret came up in short order. And at 7:09 p.m. on that night, April 12th, 1945, Harry Truman said those words, "I, Harry S. Truman, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." He kissed the Bible. The look on the beautiful lady's face in the middle of that photograph, I think, tells the whole story. Mrs. Truman did not want this moment. Mr. Truman did not want this moment. Margaret Truman did not want this moment. Their faces speak volumes. That scene that you're looking at there is also captured from a few different angles on silent film. And of course, it is silent. But I believe that even if there was sound on those film clips, it would have been completely silent. That's how somber the moment was. Shortly after that photograph was taken, the entire cabinet was there. The Secretary of War went to now President Truman and told President Truman that there was a very pressing affair that he needed to speak about. And Truman probably did not know at least completely what Secretary of War Stimson was talking about. Presidents today, my friends, are judged on their first 100 days. And that's a metric that sort of stretches back to Franklin Roosevelt in his first term starting in 1933. What I would propose to you tonight, my friends, is that very few presidents ever faced in their first 100 days what Harry Truman did. He inherited a world war raging in Europe and in the Pacific. Perhaps there was an end in sight, but no guarantee of it. He inherited being commander-in-chief of the mightiest armed forces in the world. He inherited the most powerful nation in the world being the head of it. He inherited a process that was starting to look towards the post-war world. The burden on that man's shoulders, starting on April 12th of 1945, is incredible. And again, what I propose to you is that all of these things that we've talked about over the last few moments prepared Harry Truman for this time, perhaps more than he ever knew, And it was going to be essential for Harry Truman to have at his side those two beautiful ladies, the First Lady and the First Daughter. They were at his side on his 61st birthday, May 8th of 1945, the end of the war in Europe, Victory in Europe Day. And Truman and the world started to look at the post-war world and how we could help our vanquished enemies in Europe. And now the focus would be on ending the war in the Pacific. But one thing really challenged the new president at the beginning of 1945, at the beginning of June 1945. The First Lady, their daughter Margaret, and Mrs. Wallace left Washington, D.C. to come back to independence. We'd like to share with you this particular letter, June 3rd of 1945. Those of you who love to study Truman Land, you're very familiar with the Dear Bess letters. They are absolutely the best tool I think that we could ever have as the storytellers of Truman's legacy. The White House, June 3rd, 1945. Dear Bess, this is a lonesome place. Harry Vaughn and I came back to the White House and found Rachel just leaving. We should have taken her to the train, but I didn't think of it. Brew came in and I had to settle some matters for him. Then Harry and I went over to the Statler and attended a party for Steve Early, given by the White House Correspondents Association. It was a nice party. We stayed about an hour and then came back to the White House and had dinner. Harry went on home and I went to work. When my eyes got tired of reading, I went and got out the piano records for the radio and gave myself a concert. They brought me some orange juice and I went to bed at 10:30 and read a gossip phone conversation between the Justice of the Supreme Court and one of Drew Pearson's stooges in Vincent's office. It was funny, but also bad business. The so-called palace guard hate to give up. I'm causing them much worry, I'm afraid. We're also on the edge of a good old-fashioned cleanup in the State Department. Not at the top and in the middle. It's no wonder we have no adequate representation abroad. Hope you had a nice trip. I wanted to go very badly, but of course I couldn't. Much love, Harry. Now in that letter, President Truman makes reference to Steve Early. He was President Roosevelt's press secretary who had recently tendered his resignation to the President of the United States. Harry Truman accepted Steve Early's resignation and appointed in his place his old high school colleague, the valedictorian, Charles G. Ross, who gave up a much better paying job in St. Louis. He had already received a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting for a St. Louis newspaper, but the new press secretary gave up that job, gave up everything that he had, and came and served his old classmate. June 12th, 1945, I'd like to share this letter with you too. The White House. Dear Bess, Just 2 months ago today, I was a reasonably happy and contented vice president. Maybe you can remember that far back too, but things have changed so much it hardly seems real. I sit here in this old house and work on foreign affairs, read reports, and work on speeches, all the while listening to the ghosts walk up and down the hallway and even right in here in the study. The floors pop and the drapes move back and forth, and I can just imagine old Andy and Teddy having an argument over Franklin, or James Buchanan and Franklin Pierce deciding which was the more useless to the country. And when Millard Fillmore and Chester Arthur join in for place and show, the din is almost unbearable. But I will get some work done. Hope the weather lets up and you will be able to do some work on the house. Much love, Harry. I was reading another letter late last night, and please forgive me, I wanted to share this letter with you too. This is, I think, a very crucial letter, and it's one that we don't necessarily hear or read an awful lot. The White House, Washington, D.C., June 11th, 1945. My dear daughter, your letter was most welcome. I read it with a lot of appreciation. You evidently are just finding out what a terrible situation the president's daughter is facing. That was the main reason for my not wanting to be vice president. I knew what it would mean to you, your mother, to your aunts and uncles and grandmothers and cousins, particularly those named Truman, if what has happened came about. But you'll have to try and bear it the best you can because it is a reality. And as old Cleveland said, you are facing a condition, not a theory. So you must face it. Keep your balance and go along just as your dad is trying to go. People will be trying to find something in your conduct and in mine to talk about and criticize. If they really have something to find fault with them, of course, it is too bad. But if there is no truth in what they say, we must go along, doing right, and paying no attention to the dirt which is thrown at us. That has been my policy since I was a little boy, and just look where it landed me. Maybe I was wrong. I'm sending you a tissue of lives put out by Drew Pearson, which brought on this philosophical discourse. Had a lot of fun with Rethel about it. It is funny when you consider that your dad not only didn't chase you out of town, that he felt like weeping when you did leave, even in spite of that bad spell of humor. I've always known that Washington is a hick town. In fact, I don't know of a so-called hick town that isn't a better and more friendly place, but I can never make you and your mama believe it. I hope you'll have a nice time at home, and I'll count the days until you return. I'm not going to San Francisco until the next week. Had a nice boat ride Sunday with the newsmen who went to the rounds with me on the VP campaign last fall. Glad you went to see Aunt Mary and Mama. Write your dad when you have time. Kiss your mama for me. Lots and lots of love, Dad. It's a very important letter to helping understand who Harry Truman was in the summer of 1945. Truman had some unfinished business. Aside from authorizing Eleanor Roosevelt to take a military plane to be at her husband's side, that could be considered Harry Truman's first decision as President of the United States. But really, for all intents and purposes, Harry Truman's first decision was to allow the opening proceedings of the United Nations to proceed. And how much I believe he would have liked to have had Mrs. Truman and Margaret at his side when he went to San Francisco to witness the signing of the Charter of the United Nations. But as we mentioned earlier, Mrs. Truman, Margaret, and Mrs. Truman's mother, Madge Gates Wallace, they came back to independence in early June of 1945. One of the reasons that they did that was that Mrs. Truman was about to undertake quite a significant project at 219 North Delaware Street. 219 North Delaware Street, Independence, Missouri, became a pretty famous place A lot of people recognized whose home it was just when they heard the address. Now, we'd like to show you a photograph of 219 North Delaware Street, a historic one. The home that we call today the Truman home was actually built by Bess Wallace Truman's grandparents, George and Elizabeth Emery Gates. The first part of what we call the Truman home was built right after the end of the American Civil War, we think. And then an addition was put on several decades later. The home itself reflected who George and Elizabeth Gates were. Mr. Gates was a partner in a flour mill not too far from the home, and he was of the moneyed class in Independence. Now, were George and Elizabeth Gates millionaires? No. Were they thousandaires? Yes. And that's really what counted in Independence at that time. But by the time Harry Truman came into the picture with the wedding to Bess Wallace in 1919, probably that money was on its way to being gone. At one time, with the birth of Mary Margaret Truman inside of that house in February of 1924, there are 4 generations living in that house at one time. That's something absolutely wonderful to think about. But by the time Harry Truman was nominated for, ran for, and was elected vice president in 1944 and inaugurated in 1945, the House was really starting to show its age. The photograph that you're looking at there is a photograph probably from around 1904, while it was owned by George and Elizabeth Gates, and that is how 219 North Delaware Street looked probably when a young Harry S. Truman started courting Bess Wallace in 1910. Originally, the thinking is that perhaps the outside of the Truman home had a color very similar to my uniform shirt, if you can see it, sort of a gray color. Memories sort of disagree on that. But by 1945, there was a lot that needed fixed at 219 North Delaware Street. And Mrs. Truman recognized that. And we have to remember that it was her mother's house, and so everything had to have her mother's approval. That was one of the big reasons, if not the biggest reason, that Bess Wallace Truman came home with her family in June of 1945, was to borrow a phrase from HGTV, to flip 219 North Delaware Street a little bit. We'd like to show you another photograph right now that if there are any of you who work for the Occupational and Safety Health Administration, I apologize for this. This is about as un-OSHA a photograph as we could find, but it shows some of the work being done at 219 North Delaware Street. Some of the rotting wood and the gingerbread and the lattice and floorboards and such around the house, they were being replaced. I can imagine, just as we battle some of the elements today with mold and mildew and deteriorating paint, that was taking its toll on the home as well. And so Mrs. Truman oversaw a project to shape up 219 North Delaware Street. And we think perhaps for the first time, when all was said and done, 219 North Delaware Street got a shining white coat of paint. So it would be forever known as the Summer White House. Now, those of you who perhaps have run an elective office before, you know very well that when you run for elective office, not everybody's going to vote for you. And that was true for Harry Truman, whether he was running for county judge, either the Eastern District position or the presiding judge position. Not everybody voted for him, of course, when he ran for senator for the state of Missouri. And not everybody voted for the Roosevelt Truman ticket. And that's true of independents. Not everybody voted for Harry Truman. And many cases that I've read, it wasn't anything personal against Harry Truman. He was just of the Democratic Party, and some people were not going to vote for him because he was a Democrat. But I'd like to take a few moments and give a tip of the Ranger hat to the people of Independence, Missouri, because one of the things that the people of Independence did while all this was going on at the home was they passed the hat around the town and collected some funds, and they paid for and provided a new flagpole be erected in the front yard of 219 North Delaware Street. And the tradition holds that the site where the flagpole is today was selected by Mrs. Truman and Mrs. Wallace. And so every day that we raise the flag at 219 North Delaware Street, and we're hoping to be able to do that again soon, every time that we raise that flag at 219 North Delaware, we tip our hats to the people of independence, because the raising of the flag signifies that the president was in residence. Well, in one of the other letters that Harry Truman wrote to Mrs. Truman, he laid out what he was going to do travel-wise. So 75 years ago this month, Harry Truman made a trip up to the Pacific Northwest and visited in Washington State, took a little bit of a vacation, and then, proud as a newborn father, he went for the signing ceremony of the United Nations. And I'd like to share with you just a little bit of the speech that Harry Truman gave speaking to the United Nations, because I just love some of the things that he said. He said, "The Charter of the United Nations, which you have just signed, is a solid structure upon which we can build a better world. History will honor you for it. Between the victory in Europe and the final victory in Japan in this most destructive of all wars, you have won a victory against war itself. It was the hope of such a charter that helped sustain the courage of stricken peoples throughout the darkest days of the war. For it is a declaration of great faith by the nations of the earth, faith that war is not inevitable, faith that peace can be maintained. If we had had this charter a few years ago, and above all, the will to use it, millions now dead would be alive. If we should falter in the future in our will to use it, millions now living will surely die." Very powerful words by the new president of the United States. One of the programs that I absolutely love that the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum does, and their wonderful education specialists and the Truman Library Institute helps make possible, is the White House Decision Center. And from an outsider, it does my heart good to see the young students of the world coming to Mr. Truman's beloved library, learning the principles of government. And when I see those young students working in the Decision Center or walking around the Truman Library, or when they come to the Truman home and visit with us, I look in their eyes and I have a confidence in those young visitors. And as I reread these words from President Truman's speech to the United Nations, I really do believe that we can have confidence in our youths, that they will make our world a better place. I really do believe that. Now, as anxious as Harry Truman was to be in San Francisco for the signing of the United Nations Charter, he was also very anxious to come home and arrived in Kansas City in short order. And one of the things that Harry Truman did when he came home in June of 1945 was he received an honorary Doctor of Laws degree from the University of Kansas City. And again, I don't wish to share the whole speech that he gave that day, but I'd like to share just a little bit of it with you, because it is really one of the most reflective and autobiographical things that Harry Truman uttered. So this is June 28th, 1945. And remember the date, June 28th. It's a very important date we'll talk about. But in the middle of receiving this honorary degree, President Truman said, "The night before last, I arrived in Salt Lake City, Utah at 10 p.m. from San Francisco, which I had left on the same time schedule at 8 p.m. I left Salt Lake City the next morning after breakfast, and oh, what a breakfast that was, that arrived in Kansas City, Missouri in exactly 3 hours and a half. My grandfather made that trip time and again from 1846 to 1854, and again from 1864 to 1870. And when he made that trip, it took him exactly 3 months to go and 3 months to come back. That is the age in which we live. The time is coming when that trip, in my opinion, will be made in 1 hour and a half instead of 3 hours and a half. The time is coming when we will be transporting the freight of the world and the express of the world and the mail of the world on a schedule that will be almost up with the travel of the earth in its turn on the axis. We must become adjusted to that situation. No further from here to Salt Lake City or Salt Lake City to San Francisco than it was from here to Lone Jack in eastern Jackson County when we used to go to the picnics there on the 16th of August to celebrate the beginning of the Democratic campaign in the fall. I'm anxious to bring home to you that the world is no longer country size, no longer state size, no longer nation size. It is one world, as Wilkie said. It is a world in which we must all get along. And it is my opinion that this great republic ought to lead the way. My opinion is that this great republic ought to carry out those ideals of Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt. Again, I can't tell you how much I appreciate this privilege, how much I appreciate the honor. I went to Kansas City School of Law for 2.5 years. As I told the alumni this afternoon, I might have been able to finish that course in another 1.5 years. I say I might have been, if it hadn't been for the fact that at the time I was a public servant here in Jackson County. I had so many people interested in the welfare of the county who wanted to see me that I couldn't study law. Now I have just about, I was going to say maybe 1,000 times that many people who are interested in the welfare of the United States, but they have a much more difficult time discussing that with me individually than they did when I was a county judge. So I want you to consider that because I've come here and have seen all of you face to face, that I've theoretically shaken hands with every one of you. And you can go home and say that you have done it. You want me to be physically able to carry out this tremendous task that has devolved upon me. I must be physically able to do that. And I can't possibly see everybody and talk to everybody in Jackson County and go back to Washington and convince the Senate that they ought to ratify this treaty. I know the Senate because I worked in the Senate for about 10 years. I can't thank you enough. I don't dare to stop and think about it because I would just stand up here and shed tears. And that is not what you want to see me do. I do appreciate that more than I can tell you. Thank you very much. One of the other things that Harry Truman did when he came home in June of 1945 was he had his first and only independence press conference. I would encourage all of you, my friends, to either find a printed copy of the papers of Harry S. Truman, or they are marvelously organized on the Truman Library's website, trumanlibrary.gov. And one of the most incredible things that you will find in the Truman papers are the transcripts from his press conferences. I would almost say that they are fun. Actually, I will say that they are fun to read. Very serious, of course, very serious, but they are incredibly fun to read. And they also show how quickly Harry Truman grasped the subject, the office of the presidency of the United States. This is the photograph that we have of the press conference that he held in what is now known as the Truman Memorial Building on Maple in Independence, Missouri. And you can see the reporters gathered around the table. Now, at the beginning of these press conferences, the press secretary, who's now Charles Ross, would remind the employees that everything was off the record unless they said that it was on the record. And then the president frequently interjected and said when they could quote him. And you can see how intimate that was. We had hoped to recreate this program this year. We're not going to be able to because of the situations in the world, but we will do it someday because I love the transcript to this particular press conference. And again, please find the Truman press conference and read them. They're absolutely wonderful. Again, I'm not going to read to you the entire transcript. I have one question and one answer that I would like to read to you. So this is from June 27th, 1945 at that building. Reporter says, "Wouldn't you like to say a few words about your reactions to this homecoming?" And the president said, "I was overwhelmed with it, of course. All these people have seen me 2 or 3 times a day for the last 30 or 40 years. I can't see what there is about me now that would make them turn out like they did today." He was a hometown boy who had done good. He had done good. So Truman went to the West Coast, witnessed the signing of the United Nations Charter, and to the credit of President Truman and all of those who worked on the process, that treaty passed the United States Senate by a vote of 98-2. So congratulations to President Truman on that. And of course, the United Nations is still a vital part of who we are today. Truman came home and received that honorary Doctor of Law degree from the University of Kansas City, gave that press conference, spoke also at the Community of Christ Auditorium. But I would propose to you that one of the reasons, if not the big reason, that Harry Truman came home 75 years ago this week was that it was his wedding anniversary on June 28th. 26 years to that beautiful, blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl that he had fallen in love with at the age of 6. She was 5. She was his partner in life. And now, so was Margaret, and so was Mrs. Wallace and the extended family. They were partners with him. And for Harry S. Truman, there was really no place like home. And so he was home for that wedding anniversary. A few days after the wedding anniversary and after visiting family, Harry Truman began preparing for another trip, the most consequential trip that Harry Truman would make. It would be to Potsdam, Germany. He would meet with Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, Clement Attlee, and Harry Truman, Churchill, Stalin, and the others. They helped create the world that we are living in right now. A little while ago, I mentioned that when they graduated in 1901 together, Charlie Ross was a valedictorian of the class. Now, one of the teachers that Harry Truman, Bess Wallace, and Charlie Ross had was a lady by the name of Tilly Brown. When they graduated in 1901, Miss Tilly Brown went up and gave Charlie Ross a kiss on the cheek for being valedictorian. Harry Truman was jealous. He asked Miss Tilly, well, when do I get a kiss? And Miss Tilly looked at him and said, Mr. Truman, when perhaps you accomplish something that deserves it. In a moment of reflection, shortly after Charles Ross took the job as press secretary, they were in the White House, and Truman had the idea of calling Miss Brown and said, now, Miss Brown, this is the President of the United States. How about that kiss? And she said, you come to Independence and get it, and you can have that kiss. He received that kiss from Miss Tilly Brown 75 years ago this week. President Truman had done the class of 1901 proud, as had Bess Wallace and Charles Ross. I'd like to end this presentation with one of my favorite photographs in the world. It's President Truman with his mother, Martha Ellen Young. What a life she had lived. Not too many of our presidents have had their mothers survive long enough to see their sons take the oath of office as President of the United States. Thankfully, Harry Truman's mother survived long enough. A few weeks after Truman became president, for Mother's Day, Mama Truman came to Washington, D.C. and got to see where her son lived now, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the place that he called home. When Truman came home, each and every time, he would go down to Grandview and visit his mother and sister Mary Jane and brother John Vivian and his family. And every time they talked on the phone, Mama Truman and her son, or every time that the president visited his mother in person here in Jackson County, Missouri, when it was time to say goodbye to one another, Mama Truman would just look her son right in the eye and say, be good, Harry. I don't care if you're 5 years old, 1 year old, 21 years old, 61 years old, 63 years old. That is some of the most wonderful advice and important advice that a mother could give, to look you right in the eyes and say, be good, Harry. So Harry Truman took the oath of office to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. He was aware that the weight of the world was on his shoulders. As I said earlier, I believe that everything that Truman did up until that point helped prepare him for the job that he did as President of the United States. But perhaps more than anything, all that Harry Truman ever needed to hear was simply the phrase, You be a good boy now, Harry. I hope that we have some questions that we'd like to talk about.
Yeah, thank you, Doug, for a wonderful presentation. If you have a question and haven't added it to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, please go ahead and do so now. You can also like a question that's already been submitted that you would like to see answered. And here, our first question is from John, and it says, how many times did President Truman visit Independence during his presidency?
That's a good question, and I'm unable to give you a complete answer for that. Just off the top of my head, including the trip back to bury his mother in 1947, I'm thinking 12. But that's going to give me something fun to look into and research. Now, along those lines, and I'm sorry I'm not able to answer that completely. Along those lines, Mrs. Truman frequently did come back to Independence without her husband, and that's a continuing theme. When you read the so-called Dear Bess letters, is that when she would come home, that he missed her very much. So I very much encourage you to find the Dear Bess letters as well, and they are also beautifully categorized on the Truman Library's website, where you can read both the original letters and then transcriptions of them. That was something that President Truman never really was able to adjust to, not having his wife and daughter and Mother Wallace there. Family for him was absolutely everything, and it was very much a void. And that's something that I'm sure many of you out there today can understand. I never truly, honestly appreciated that until I took this job in 2017. When I took this job so that my kids could stay in school and finish out the school year, I was up here in Missouri for about 6 months without my family. And that was a very painful, long, tough 6 months. And there were many nights where I completely understood, but at the same time, it's not on the same level where you have this man, President of the United States, not having his family there as that moral support. And plus, at the same time, I had so many tools at my fingertips that the Trumans did not have, with Facebook and Skype and things like that. But, when Truman came home, however, there was no place like home for him. He just loved this area.
Excellent. All right, our next question is from Ed, and Ed asked, the high school class is overwhelmingly female. Is this because so many men went into farming and didn't go through high school? And a good question, Ed, and I do believe that. And I was thinking about that one day last year. I went back and I was looking at the records. One of the things that Charlie Ross and Harry Truman did was they established a yearbook that the Independent School District is still using, called the Gleam. And I went back and looked at some of the records, and generally it appears as if the ratio is around 60 to 70 to 30% female and male. So I often wonder about that. Now, that being said, neither Harry Truman's brother nor his sister got a high school diploma. So they did not. So I don't know exactly what that means, but that may support, because now was after Truman graduated that the family left Independence and went back to Kansas City, and then, yeah, they were down on the farm in Grandview. So that may support your theory. Good question, Ed. Thank you. All right. Our next question comes from Mr. Warmbold. It says, what was the biggest decision he made in the summer White House while president? Did any foreign leaders visit the House? Oh, good question. President Truman, I'm going to echo his words. President Truman often said that generally his most difficult decision as president of the United States was going into Korea in 1950. And Truman received that phone call at 219 North Delaware Street during one of those trips home in 1950. He was there
with Mrs. Truman. Margaret, their nephew, David Wallace, was there, and he received the news of Korea. And in short order after the news was confirmed, Truman went back to Washington, D.C., and the response with the Korea situation in the United Nations came to be. So I think President Truman would say receiving the news of Korea. As to dignitaries visiting the home, it appears during 1945 to 1953 that happened, but more that happened in the retirement. And one of the most fun things to do is to stand in the foyer of the Truman home, or even the living room that I'm using as my virtual background today, and imagine the heads of state. You had queens there, and you had successive presidents of the United States and congressmen and senators visit 219 North Delaware Street. And that reminds me of a wonderful line that one of their neighbors told me 2 or 3 years ago. I just happened to ask this neighbor, I said, well, what was it like living next to a president of the United States? And he said, well, really, it was just like having any other couple living next to us, except that presidents and congressmen came to visit with movie and television stars and musicians. So I love that. I love that answer.
All right, we have time for one final question, and it comes from Alan. It says, how did someone without a college degree or military service get to be a captain?
Get to be a captain, that's a very good question. And yeah, because of Truman's family's financial situation, he wasn't able to fulfill that dream. And I think that's one of the reasons why he was so humbled with this honorary degree. That was one of several that he received as president of the United States. One of the ways I could answer that question, I think, is that he had previous military service. He had joined the Missouri Guard shortly after graduating high school. There's a wonderful story that comes from that. He was very proud of the uniform that he received while serving in the Missouri Guard. It was a very bright blue with red stripes going down the side of the trousers. And he was very excited for his mother and father and brother and sister and grandmother, everybody to see that he was serving in the Guard. Well, he went to the farm, and you have to understand that Truman's maternal family, they suffered greatly during the Civil War, frequently at the hands of Union soldiers, with a tremendous amount of property and emotional and mental collateral damage from that. And when Truman's grandmother saw him wearing the uniform of a blue soldier, she all but chased him off of the property, telling him not to wear the blues around them ever again, because they were still associating the color of the blue uniform with the Union soldiers during the Civil War. So I think that it was part because of his previous service, serving with some guns in the Missouri Guard, and then too, just the quick learning that he did. Because of his vision, he wasn't able to get an appointment to West Point and such, but he was a quick study. So when he was ready to leave and serve in World War I, he was actually a lieutenant, and then he later found out retroactively that he had been promoted to Captain Truman. Now here's something a lot of people don't know. I think it's wonderful. It's a wonderful story. When Truman came home in 1919, and he married the love of his life, Bess Wallace, it may have been his intention to formally leave military service and de-enlist from the service, but he continued. And he continued in the militia in the reserves. And I think that it became very important to Harry Truman, in that later when he got into politics, it gave him a mental break to serve in our nation's uniform. He continued to serve in our military reserves until the beginning of 1953, January or February, I think, of 1953, when he was formally, as Colonel Truman, put on the retired list. One of the reasons I think that is neat is that for the years 1945 to 1953, technically, Harry S. Truman was his own commander-in-chief. And don't think about that an awful lot. But then too, when Truman came home in 1953 as former president of the United States, being at that time that there was no pension for former presidents. His only income was a modest Army pension of just over $110 a month. And one of the reasons that that pension was calculated the way that it was that it took into account his service for the first stint in the local militia, and then from 1917 till 1953. But that was part of who Harry Truman was. So, great question.
Excellent.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all for joining us today, and special thanks to Doug Richardson for this excellent and informative presentation.
Thank you.
As we celebrate the 75th anniversary of Truman's presidency throughout this year, we are excited to announce the launch of the Truman Special Reserve Bourbon. Local distillery Tomstown is releasing this limited edition 11-year-old bourbon in honor of Truman's anniversary year, with a percentage of the proceeds donated to help fund the Truman Library's renovation. Truman Library members and friends get special access to purchase the bourbon before it goes on sale to the public tomorrow at noon. Visit our website at trumanlibraryinstitute.org to purchase your bottle of Truman's favorite drink and support his presidential library. To find more information about future programs commemorating the 75th anniversary of Truman's presidency, like the one listed here, be sure to follow the Truman Library Institute on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks again, Doug, and thanks for joining us, everyone.